So Zach, a question I've had over the course of this last week has been wondering how should Christians be interacting online? And I think a second question goes with that is, what are the role of the local churches in helping with that, or how does the online environment affect the authority of local churches?
I would say you have to look at it at a microscopic level first, because if you practice it at this level, then you're going to be better at living out at a macro level. And so I think of James, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and even slower to anger. And I think that's not just Christian advice. I think that's practical advice for everyone, because the technology is geared towards these quick emotional interactions. And if we're having those quick responses, we're not taking time to consider the context, the purpose, or really think through the implications of what we're saying. Because as teachers, we're going to be held accountable for everything we say and do. And so I think we have to be very careful about the words we choose, and are we saying them in love? And coming back to our own motivations. Why am I speaking? Is it to feel justified, to feel right, to feel powerful? Or am I speaking to add clarification and show love in this instance?
In the case of our posture towards the unbelieving world, the non-Christian world, it is a posture of engagement. It is a posture of, in the case of the Great Commission, it is a posture of making disciples and teaching. So there is this expectation of interaction and engagement, which raises an interesting question about how do we go about being effective ambassadors for Christ? How do we go about living out that Great Commission to, as we go, make disciples in the digital space? Because I think the digital space has a lot of possibility for that, a lot of potential good for that, that can, unfortunately, if we're not taking that pre-existing posture of being quick to listen, slow to speak, can often be obscured by a lot of the negativity and general craziness that's come to characterize social platforms.
Well, I think there's two levels that makes me think of, is the personal, but then also what you asked at the start of the exchange was, what role do the churches have? Yeah. I think on the personal level, just not to delve too deeply into politics, but when President Trump decided that he was leaving the climate accord, there was one congressman who said, I trust God on these things. And I had a friend.
I saw that one.
I had a friend who said, so does that mean we just don't take any action? And it was very critical of Christianity as a whole. And practicing what I preach, I step back from that and try to consider in context and then speak into the situation with clarification. So I think we also have to consider what our intentions are when we're interacting with non-believers. Is it just to feel right, to feel vindicated, or am I actually living out the fruits of the Spirit? Am I responding with love to try and help clarify the situation?
I like the idea of expanding the, sorry to interrupt, but I like the idea of bringing in the fruits of the Spirit as not just responding in love, but with gentleness, with kindness. Just look at it if that characterizes your response, what kind of language should you be using? That eliminates a lot of language that is typically used.
The fire.
Yeah, exactly. But continue. I just thought that was a great example.
The other step I would say is when thinking about, and I love the article you posted about consideration of how Christians should behave in the blogosphere. It's funny because this week we've been talking about this pushback against institutions that put all these pressures from the top down. And yet I would have to say I agree with the article about the church stepping up to have some sort of authority in these matters, because as teachers we are held more accountable. So we wouldn't go to a surgeon if they were only had 1 year of medical school. Right. So I think blogs are important to give voices to those who have typically not been heard within the church. But it makes me think a little bit of small groups. There is a certain level of accountability there. If a small group leader is saying something that is not sound in biblical principle, there's going to be pushback from the group but also from those who are above that small group leader.
Right.
And I think the church has to step up and provide some form of structure to hold people accountable. And I think, in my perspective, that's just healthy and practical, because we don't, otherwise we're giving voices to people who have the biggest platform, can say the most outrageous things just to cull attention.
Yeah, and your comment on church leaders have to step up and be willing to give input and teach on this brings a couple things to my mind. First, this idea that to recognize that is not abnormal. Like, this is not, this role of local church leaders to speak into a current situation, especially current information uses, and say, hey, this is how we think it's wisest to interact with it. This is what would look like to be, disciples of Christ in this context. That's more or less what church leaders have been doing all along. In this case, with the blogosphere and social media, the context, it's really just the tools being used that changes, and it doesn't change the role of the local church to speak into it. I mean, local churches have been speaking into film, they've been speaking into music, they've been speaking into literature and books. I mean, as civilization has grown and cultures have developed and different tools for promoting and generating art have developed, I mean, the church has always been there commenting on it and giving instruction on it. Some better than others, but at the same time, just recognizing that role for Christian teachers has always been there. And I think what we might be running up to or running up against now is this idea of, I wonder how many pastors really feel comfortable commenting on things like the blogosphere or things like social media. I mean, do they understand how it works?
Well, that's why what stood out to me is, you said, some more successful than others. I think it goes back to that idea of elevating the discourse, and I think equipping people to speak into the situations.
Yeah, that's a great point, yeah.
Because as a theater person, I'm always aware of that tension between the arts and faith.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that discord comes from when the two sides don't understand each other and aren't really listening to one another.
Sure.
And so I think we just have to be willing to make mistakes as we grow and learn about the other person, about this field, and accept that we're going to be uncomfortable as we enter into this area. I mean, am I oversimplifying it? Because I think I might.
Well, I don't know if oversimplifying might be the best term, just because I do think in a topic that's really big and can feel really complicated and overwhelming, I think you do have to walk it back for a lot of people to say, like, let's think about this as simply as possible, and then as we have more experience, as we gather more anecdotal or even larger data sets of information, we can start to layer on the nuance. But I do think oftentimes people try to, especially when it comes to social media and with the plethora of platforms that are out there, I do think people try to get their hands around all of it at once, and often will miss some of those more nuanced components, like Boyd points out, of how people will use different platforms for different purposes. And I think it's important then to start at that very simple, like, functionally, foundationally, what is this, and how should we be beginning to interact with it. I really like the idea of the need to not just elevate discourse and model good discourse, but then to equip. I mean, it's to in relationship to leaders in local churches, this idea of teachers helping other teachers is really really important. I think you bring up a great point for that. I think that's really helpful. Switching gears just slightly, or maybe a lot. One of the things that I've been really concerned about over the last couple of years in particular, or maybe the last 3 years, has been the tone of how other Christians talk to one another. Because we can talk about how the local church and Christians in general will interact with the broader culture via social platforms things like that. But I think one of the things that can most greatly damage the Christian witness in a cultural space is the relationship of Christians with other Christians and how it's modeled, demonstrated, talked about. And I think that's where the social media world can be both really, really helpful, but can also be so damaging because it's so easy to find places in which a lack of love is being demonstrated. And so I guess one of the things I would love to hear your thoughts on here then is when it comes to Christian relationships with other Christians in the online space, on social media platforms, how do we love one another well when there are so many opportunities to disagree, when there's so many opportunities to think poorly of someone? Because one of the things that has put me in mind to be thinking about this has been how quickly I've seen other Christians question other Christians' faith and faith experiences in the online space, which is shocking to me that we'd even think that that's somehow okay, or one, we have a corner on the market of determining someone's faith and its depth and their entire experience of God. But we still do it. And so do you think that's something that is growing out of an immature faith? Is it something that is just reflective of sin issues in an individual's life? Or, and I mean, I think we can say it might be some of that to a degree, or it might be, maybe it's and. To what degree does the nature or character or built environment of a social media platform create that? Or do you think that's stepping too far?
No, that's a lot to unpack. And so I'll try and hit on some of the things that came to me as you were speaking. I think coming from a theatrical perspective, so much of my time in training was reconditioning me to find conflict, essentially, because that's what a drama is made of.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But with respect to that, you have to take the other person in. And so I'm kind of a softie. I'm a kind of guy who wears his heart on his sleeve. And so I am always struck by the lack of love that people sometimes exhibit online and even face-to-face. But what I was reminded of particularly was what Dr. Jacobs said earlier this week. It's so easy for me to keep track of the wrongs done to myself while pushing off the wrongs I could be doing, that I am doing to other people that I'm completely unaware of.
Yeah.
And so part of me believes that it's a little bit of the human condition, a little bit of that fallen nature, sin, where we take things so personally that we're not even thinking about the other person, not thinking about the context or their perspective.
Right.
And so I think in some level we have to get back to having real dialogue with people. And really making sure that I understand what that other person is saying before I try and force my perspective onto it. And I do think it's this cyclical relationship where the technology is not fostering those types of conversations, but we're not taking the personal responsibility to elevate it. And so it becomes this catch-22 that's self-feeding.
That's a good point,
Anything in there that...
I really like that point about being kind of a vicious cycle of where the technology can reinforce pre-existing problems with a lack of elevated dialogue and things like that. So a question that came to my mind as you were saying that then is, so are the social media platforms even capable of elevating that dialogue, even if people are willing to take the responsibility to work to elevate the dialogue? I know that's something that I and a few of my friends have had a lot of conversations about, are trying to do, but I wonder as a built online environment, are they built with the capacity to do that? And I should say, because there are different platforms, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. One, is it possible? And two, are some platforms better at that than others, in your opinion?
I think it's possible to take the conversation to a certain point. And I've seen this modeled by some Christian leaders in my life who post scholarly articles, and then they'll have an ongoing discussion backed up with research, evidence, and it is carefully worded. But still you get this super long thread that no one's going to read outside of perhaps the two people who are engaged.
Yeah.
So I think you can take some action, but I think some platforms, they're just not well-designed tools for that type of discourse. And some are better fit for that mode of communication than others. But I'm not a designer by any means, so I feel a little inept at discussing some of these particulars. But I think just from a human perspective, there is such a glut of information that you scroll through and you do the 30 seconds of whatever you find most interesting. And so it may not be pulling other people into that conversation at an effective level.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think what would be really cool would be to see if there's a way to limit the number of responses on a... So I'm thinking in terms of Facebook here. You share an article on Facebook. How cool it would be to limit the number of responses from people and maybe even specifically tag specific people that you want to comment on the point. And that would actually create this limit on who can engage, but yet the engagement is valuable enough for anyone reading it to actually have some takeaway and some thought. Because I like the point about saying it can take the conversation to a point. So I think maybe embracing the recognition of those limitations and actually building the limitations into the platform, as opposed to just saying, well, we'll just have this open-ended ability for people to engage, but we still recognize that it only is really valuable to this point. Well, then build that point into the platform. And could that help? I wonder if that could be a case. A friend of mine I was talking to last night actually made an offhand comment in relationship to social media. It's just said, well, it's kind of irritating. People seem to only read headlines now anyway. And I thought to myself, all right, we can say that that's frustrating, or we can take an approach that we had in one of our readings this week with Jacob's thesis for disputation. Like, post a thesis, right? Like, just make a thesis statement essentially. Ask someone or a couple of people to comment on it, and all of a sudden you have food for thought and some few initial comments to kind of tease that out a little bit, and then you just leave that there for people to consider. I wonder if that would be a simple way to just get people asking some helpful questions and the first step to elevating conversation.
Well, I think that's a perfect example of a jig. It's a tool that we designed to help the human flourishing. And I thought of this the other day when Apple had their developers conference. I thought they made several jigs that were designed to deal with some of the annoyances we have online. Like the next operating system is going to help you block out those ads that follow you once you've gone to Amazon and you've bought the shoes. And just another example of how I think slowly we're starting to make steps to deal with the problems, or even Mark Zuckerberg hiring people to deal with fake news or people monitoring to make sure people aren't going live and committing acts of violence on Facebook. I think eventually it's easy for us to respond in a spirit of fear, but I think as humans we do eventually try to adjust to what we perceive as a society as a major issue.
That's a great point.
And that may be naively optimistic on my part.
Well, but I think we have to remember, too, just how new this technology is. Right? I mean, I just got a notice on Facebook that, which blew my mind the other day, that apparently I had been on Facebook for 12 years. I apparently set up my profile in 2005. I thought, one, Facebook is literally the age of junior hires that I used to teach. I mean... And junior hires in American society are generally considered like the ultimate level of immaturity, right? And so I think if you apply that to a platform like Facebook, it's still an immature emerging technology in many respects, because there are so many of these things that it's figuring out and that they're trying to correct and everything like that. So no disrespect to junior hires in that regard. Like, I loved teaching junior hires. I love working with them. They're a wonderful group. But just in terms of human development, there is a sense of maturity. People talk about mature technologies, and I think we tend to forget that while the internet is a maturing technology, the platforms that are being built on it are not. And we need to recognize that there's still growing pains happening. And I think you just touched on that very well, is that this is, that there are still pieces being worked out. So I don't think it's necessarily naive to assume that they can't be worked out or won't be worked out. These are businesses still very much in their youth. I mean, goodness, Facebook is as young as it is. I couldn't believe it. I mean, 12 years for me to be on the platform makes it sound like a long time. Yeah. But when you think about a company that's 12 years old, it's like, well, that's a young company.
It is.
That is not. And I think the size of Facebook kind of obscures that a little bit.
It's easy to forget.
Yeah, it's easy to forget. You think, like, oh, it's been part of the cultural milieu forever. It's just like, no, it hasn't been. It's very new, very young, revolutionary, no doubt. But still, that doesn't necessarily make it mature, and that doesn't necessarily make its effects on human flourishing all positive. And so I think being clear-eyed about that is also helpful, even as we recognize that, no, it's growing and there's rooms for improvement. And they seem to recognize that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.